Hey friends, tonight we begin with dark side of Victorian life they don't show you. Before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe only if you truly enjoy this kind of slow, calming storytelling. Your support means the world and helps me keep creating peaceful spaces like this one. Tell me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I love seeing how this little quiet corner of the internet brings together people from all over the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan or some soft background, and let's gently into tonight's journey together. The story of Victorian life is often painted in gleaming shades of progress, refinement, and a sense of empire that stretched proudly across the globe. When one imagines the Victorian era, it is tempting to picture the grand streets of London, lined with stately townhouses, horse-drawn carriages clattering on cobbled roads, and gentlemen in tall hats tipping them politely as they pass women in elegant gowns. It is the vision that lingers in costume dramas and oil paintings, a world of invention and elegance, of candlelight balls and parlours buzzing with polite conversation. Yet beneath that surface, beneath the lace gloves and the polished brass of the gaslights, another story was playing out, a story most would not show on the surface. It is here, in the shadows of the Victorian age, where the truth of ordinary life reveals itself. The dark side of Victorian life was everywhere if you looked beyond the gaslight glow. For the poor, it began with the very air they breathed. Imagine the fog that London became famous for, thick yellow and choking. This was not the mist of poetry or mystery novels, but a lethal mix of soot, coal smoke, and chemical fumes pouring from thousands of chimneys. Day after day, families woke up coughing, their lungs already worn down from years of inhaling the city itself. The fog would seep indoors, through cracked windows, coating curtains with a greasy residue. Mothers tried to scrub it away, but the black dust returned, clinging to skin, bedding, even the bread they ate. It was not uncommon for children's faces to be perpetually marked with streaks of coal smudge, no matter how many times their mothers wiped them clean. Work defined Victorian existence, and it did not wait for adulthood. Many children began laboring as soon as they could walk with enough steadiness to carry a load. Step into the alleyways off the grand boulevards, and you would find tiny figures, their backs bent under the weight of water buckets, baskets of coal, or the endless delivery errands that kept city life running. Some worked in factories, bare, small hands, useful for threading spindles or clearing machinery that towered menacingly above them. The shriek of looms or the grinding roar of machinery was the soundtrack of their days. Accidents were constant. A slip of the hand, a moment's distraction, and a child might lose a finger or an arm, sometimes their very life. These tragedies were often accepted as part of the price of industrial progress. But it was not just the factories. Chimney sweeps were still common, though technically outlawed in the worst conditions. Small boys, some no older than 6, were pushed into narrow brick passages, scraping their raw skin as they climbed through soot-coated interiors, coughing and choking in the dark. They emerged blackened head to toe, their bodies carrying scars from the confined spaces they had been forced to clean. Many developed what was cruelly nicknamed sootwort, a cancerous growth caused by constant exposure to the filth. Yet, to their masters, these boys were simply cheap, expendable labor. Housing offered little refuge. The poor crowded into slums where entire families might live in a single room. Walls were damp with mold, floors dirtied with waste, and privacy was non-existent. In such places, disease thrived. Typhus, cholera, tuberculosis. These were not occasional outbreaks, but constant companions of the working class. The stench of sewage mixed with smoke from factories and sweat from the unwashed poor created an atmosphere so heavy that visitors often described feeling nauseous. Within minutes, it was in these cramped and fetid quarters that families attempted to carve out their daily existence, finding small moments of laughter or rest while surrounded by constant threat. The workhouse loomed as both a threat and a promise. For many, it was the last resort, the place one went when starvation at home became unbearable. On paper, the workhouse offered food, shelter, and employment, but in reality, it was a place of punishment designed to deter people from entering. Families were separated upon arrival, husbands to one side, wives to another, children torn away, and assigned to yet another section. Love and togetherness were deliberately fractured. The meals were meager, often little more than thin gruel or bread. Work was monotonous and exhausting, such as breaking stones into gravel or unpicking old rope until fingers bled. To enter the workhouse was to lose one's freedom, dignity, and often one's will. It was a shadow that hung over the poor like a constant threatful to low, and this fate awaited you. While the wealthy attended glittering balls and filled their parlors with the newest inventions, telegraphs, gaslighting, even early photography, the poor sought entertainment where they could. Cheap gin shops offered an escape. A few copper coins could buy a moment of forgetfulness, a chance to dull the ache of hunger or the humiliation of poverty. The gin shops were often dark, smoky, and overcrowded. Men slumped over tables, women drank beside them, and children sometimes sat in corners, quietly sipping from mugs that were supposed to belong to their parents. Alcoholism spread like a sickness of its own, tearing families apart and feeding the cycle of poverty that seemed inescapable. Prostitution thrived in the shadows of the empire. For many women, it was the only way to survive when legitimate work paid almost nothing. Seamstresses, laundresses, or servants earned pennies that barely kept them fed. But a night on the streets, as dangerous and degrading as it was, could bring in far more. Victorian London alone counted tens of thousands of women selling themselves, many little more than girls. They worked in brothels or on the streets, vulnerable to disease, violence, and arrest. Syphilis, in particular, spread through entire communities, yet treatment was minimal and cruel. These women lived on the edge of survival, invisible in the polite society that preferred to look the other way. Crime was another shadow of Victorian life. With poverty so widespread, theft became a daily occurrence. Pickpockets haunted busy streets, slipping through crowds with practiced ease. Gangs of youths roamed alleys, some no older than 12, ready to snatch purses or cut open pockets with sharp blades. For them, crime was not rebellion, but necessity. Prisons filled rapidly, and punishments were severe. Men, women, and even children found themselves locked away for crimes as small as stealing a loaf of bread. The prisons were harsh, designed to break the spirit. Silence was enforced, labor was relentless, and conditions often led to illness and death. For many, prison was not rehabilitation but another graveyard. Yet while the poor endured all this, the wealthier classes lived a life almost unrecognizable in comparison. Their homes boasted drawing rooms with velvet drapes, polished mahogany furniture, and servants who kept everything spotless. Their evenings were spent reading novels, listening to music, or attending soirees. They could afford doctors when they fell ill, tutors for their children, and even holidays by the seaside to escape the smog. For them, the dark side of Victorian life was something they might read about in a scandal sheet or glimpse, fleetingly as their carriage passed through poorer neighborhoods. It was not something that touched them directly, unless a servant brought illness into the household or a crime disrupted their peace. And so the Victorian age existed in two worlds, the one celebrated in photographs and paintings, and the one hidden in alleys, back streets, and workhouses. Both were real. Both belonged to the same city, the same country, the same empire. And it is in this contrast that the full truth of the era lies. Progress was built on suffering, refinement balanced by squalor, grandeur by despair. To walk through a Victorian street at night was to feel this divide most keenly, the gaslights glowing warmly on one side, and the cold shadows stretching long on the other. The lives of the poor, though less recorded, were every bit as real and human as those of the wealthy, and their struggles were the foundation upon which the empire stood. When night fell in Victorian cities, a different world came alive, and it was one that revealed even more of the struggles hidden beneath the surface. By day, the poor labored under factory whistles and coal dust. By night, they navigated darkened streets lit only by flickering gas lamps, their shadows stretching long across cobbled roads. In these hours, danger became a constant companion. The streets were patrolled by few, and crime flourished in the cover of darkness. For the poor, night did not bring rest, it simply shifted the shape of survival. A family living in a single damp room could not escape the noises of the city. Rats scratched in the walls, their red eyes glinting in the dimness as they scavenged for crumbs. A baby's thin cry might cut through the night, quickly hushed by an exhausted mother with little more than watered-down milk to offer. Fathers returned home after 14 hours of work, their bodies aching, their hands cracked and calloused, collapsing on straw-filled mattresses that smelled of mold. For many, sleep was shallow. Illness and hunger gnawed even in dreams, and the dread of another day weighed heavily on their chests. Disease spread most easily after sunset, when the streets turned into rivers of refuse. Human waste still flowed openly in many neighborhoods, sewage seeping into water pumps that entire districts depended on. Outbreaks of cholera or typhus could wipe out dozens of families in days. Imagine the terror of a mother watching her child grow feverish overnight, helpless to stop the violent vomiting and dehydration that followed. The nearest hospital was overcrowded and filthy, often a place where patients went to die rather than recover. If she prayed, her prayers were desperate whispers in the half-light, words swallowed by the sound of coughing from every corner of the slum. For women, nighttime often carried dangers sharper than hunger or disease. Many walked the streets too, sell themselves, drawn not by choice but by starvation. The faces of these women were etched with the strain of survival, hollow cheeks, eyes too old for their years. Some stood in doorways, their breath clouding in the cold air, waiting for a passerby. Others circled dim alleys, scanning for potential clients while keeping an ear open for the sound of approaching police or violent men. To walk this path was to gamble with one's life. Syphilis, untreated and misunderstood, ravaged countless women. The disease ate away at bodies slowly, leaving behind madness, blindness, or death. Yet the need for bread on the table outweighed fear of tomorrow. Children did not escape the darkness either. Some, with no families to claim them, formed roving gangs, their bare feet slapping on wet cobblestones. They were quick, desperate, and fearless, darting between crowds to snatch handkerchiefs, purses, or loaves of bread from open market stalls. Their laughter, sharp and mocking, echoed through the night as they disappeared into back streets, too narrow for adults to follow. These children grew up without the softness of a home or the structure of school. The city itself became their teacher, and crime their only trade. Some would be caught and thrown into prison, where silence and iron bars awaited. Others would grow harder, becoming part of organized gangs that ruled entire districts from the shadows. Even those lucky enough to avoid crime or disease felt the crushing weight of social expectations. Respectability was everything in Victorian society, and even the poor understood that being seen as immoral could mean losing what little opportunity remained. Women carried the heaviest burden. If a laundress was rumored to drink too often, or a seamstress was seen talking to the wrong man, she might lose her work. Employers were quick to dismiss servants if they suspected any impropriety, leaving women with few choices beyond the street. Shame was as powerful a weapon as poverty, and it trapped countless souls in cycles of silence and submission. Inside wealthier homes, nights looked altogether different, yet even here shadows lingered. Gas lamps flickered over polished dining tables as families gathered for evening meals of roast meats, puddings, and imported wines. Servants scurried silently in the background, refilling glasses or clearing plates. Yet beneath this polish, fear still crept in. The wealthy lived in constant dread of losing their status, of scandal ruining their names. Newspapers thrived on gossip, and one misstep could tarnish a reputation forever. Behind velvet curtains, arguments whispered of debts, failing businesses, or illicit affairs. Even in the comfort of drawing rooms, the dark side of Victorian life whispered softly, a reminder that no one was untouchable. Beyond the city and the countryside, the story was not much brighter. Rural life, often imagined as peaceful and wholesome, was marked by its own hardships. Agricultural laborers worked long days in fields, often with little more than bread and cheese to sustain them. They bent their backs under unforgiving sun or freezing winds, all for wages that barely kept their families alive. Many eventually migrated to the cities in search of better pay, only to find themselves swallowed by the slums. Their knowledge of crops and soil gave them little advantage in the world of steam engines and factories. In both city and countryside, poverty tightened its grip relentlessly. Entertainment, when it came, was crude but essential. Music halls offered the poor brief escapes, where bawdy songs and comic acts brought laughter, if only for a night. Crowds packed into smoky rooms, cheering and jeering, forgetting for a short while the hunger waiting at home. Penny dreadfuls, cheap printed stories full of murder and mysteries circulated among the young, feeding imaginations with tales of highwaymen, ghosts, and villains. These stories were lurid, exaggerated, and thrilling, but they also reflected the violence that so often touched real lives. Death was never far from Victorian existence. Funerals, for those who could afford them, were elaborate displays of mourning. Black veils, horse-drawn carriages, and solemn processions turned grief into spectacle. But for the poor, death was often unmarked, the body buried in crowded paupers, graves with no headstone to carry the name. Families who scraped together pennies for a simple coffin might still find it shared with strangers in the earth. The weight of mortality pressed constantly on the era, making every cough a potential omen, every fever a possible end. And yet, in the midst of all this bleakness, people endured. They laughed when they could, clung to scraps of joy, and built lives from fragments. A child's game in the street, a song hummed while mending clothes, a stolen kiss behind a factory wall. These were the threads of resilience woven through hardship. The Victorian poor were not only victims of their age, they were survivors, navigating a world stacked against them with stubborn determination. Their stories, though less polished than those of the rich, carried truths that history often chooses. To forget, to understand the Victorian age, is to look at both its light and its shadows. The glittering empire could not exist without the silent suffering that propped it up. The inventions, the railways, the marvels of progressal were built on backs bent under labor, lungs blackened by soot, and lives cut short by poverty. It is here, in the dim glow of gas lamps and the choking fog of factory smoke, that the real Victorian world emerges. Not the romanticized era of gowns and grand houses, but the raw, unfiltered existence of millions who struggled simply to survive. Morning in Victorian London did not always arrive gently. The thick fog that blanketed the city blurred the line between night and day. So, even as church bells chimed and carts rumbled onto the streets, the air remained heavy, grey, and damp. For the poor dawn was not a moment of renewal, lit was the start of yet another exhausting cycle. Men and women rose before the sun, rubbing sleep from their eyes as they reached for boots that had never truly dried from yesterday's rain. The first sound in many households was the cough, deep, rattling, and relentless. It echoed through narrow hallways and thin walls. The Industrial Revolution had left its mark on lungs across the empire. Coal smoke from chimneys mingled with factory soot until it settled in every breath. Children coughed until their small chests ached, their bodies struggling to keep pace with the polluted air. Mothers tried to hush them, fearful that landlords or factory overseers might hear and judge them unfit for work or residence. For those employed in factories, mornings were a race. The clang of factory bells called them with the same authority as church bells, except these bells demanded sweat, not prayer. Men filed into buildings of brick and iron, the roar of machines swallowing their footsteps. Women followed too, tying up their hair and straightening skirts already stained by oil and ash. Children, some no older than 8, squeezed into their places on factory floors, their hands small enough to reach into machinery where adult fingers could not. The rhythm of gears and hammers left no room for pause. A single mistake could cost a finger, a hand, or a life. Meanwhile, in wealthier districts, mornings unfolded differently, though even there the darker truths lingered. The upper and middle classes dressed with meticulous care, their clothing pressed, their collars starched. Carriages clattered on clean streets, drawing gentlemen to offices and ladies to social calls. Servants in these households moved silently in the background, carrying trays of tea or polishing banisters until they gleamed. But beneath the shine was exhaustion. A maid might rise at 4 a.m. to light fires in every room, her fingers raw from handling coal. A footman's smile at the door masked his own hunger, his wages barely enough to feed himself after rent was deducted from his pay. Service was its own kind of bondage, not chains and shackles, but endless hours, low wages, and the constant threat of dismissal for the smallest error. The streets themselves told a tale each morning. Vendors called out from their carts, hawking bread, fruit, or second-hand clothes. The cries mingled with the clip-clop of horses, the rattle of wheels, and the slosh of dirty water tossed from doorsteps. Children darted between legs, begging for coins or offering to shine boots. Women stood at corners, some with baskets of flowers, others with eyes hollowed by the previous night's work. The city seemed alive, yet every face bore the lines of survival. Education, though hailed as a moral good, remained elusive for most. Charity schools sprang up in poorer districts, where children sat shoulder to shoulder on hard benches, reciting letters and sums. Teachers wielded canes more often than kindness, believing that discipline was the only path to learning. Many parents pulled their children from these schools the moment wages were needed at home, condemning them to a lifetime of illiteracy. Knowledge, like wealth, was something hoarded by the fortunate. For the poor, ignorance was not a choice, but a condition imposed by necessity. In the darker corners of cities, opium dens offered another kind of escape. Men slumped on straw mats, pipes clutched loosely in their hands, the sweet, heavy smoke curling through the air. For a few pennies, misery could be dulled, hunger forgotten, grief blurred. Women too, worn by years of drudgery, sought the oblivion of opium or cheap gin. Taverns filled by midday with men who drank away their wages, leaving their families to starve. The government's attempts to curb drinking only drove demand underground. Alcohol became both a poison and a comfort, eroding lives slowly yet offering temporary relief from endless toil. Even religion, which many leaned on for solace, carried shadows. Churches preached charity, but pews were often divided by class. Wealthy families sat in polished rows at the front, their names engraved on plaques, while the poor shuffled to the back or stood in corners. Clergy spoke of moral failing when they described poverty as though sin rather than circumstance, explained empty stomachs and ragged clothes. Still, hymns rose from countless throats each Sunday, a mixture of true faith and desperate hope that suffering in this life might yield peace in the next dot. As day wore on, the stark contrasts of Victorian life grew more visible. A carriage might roll past a child scavenging coal from the roadside. A lady in silk gloves might avert her eyes from a barefoot beggar pressing against her window. Respectability required that the suffering remain unseen, tucked into alleys, or hidden in institutions like workhouses. These workhouses were meant to reform the poor, but in practice they became prisons of labor. Families were often separated the moment they entered. Men and women kept apart, children raised in barracks where affection was scarce. Meals were bland, portions meager, and punishments swift. To many, the workhouse felt less like charity and more like punishment for being born poor. But despite the grinding hardships, threads of resilience stitched communities together. Neighbors watched one another's children, shared scraps of food, and gathered for songs or stories in the evening. Markets buzzed not just with trade, but with gossip and laughter. A shoemaker might trade his skill for bread. A washerwoman might mend clothes for a neighbor's child. And in these small exchanges, humanity survived. The dark side of Victorian life was real, but so too was the unbreakable will of those who endured it. Evening eventually returned, casting gaslight shadows on weary faces. The cycle repeated itself: labor, hunger, fleeting joys, and constant struggle. The empire boasted of its progress, of railways and inventions, but beneath that glittering image, millions lived and died in quiet hardship. Their stories, rarely written in books or newspapers, were etched instead in the soot of their lungs, the calluses on their hands, and the hollow stares of their children. This was the truth of Victorian life, not the grandeur of palaces or the elegance of soirees, but the relentless endurance of ordinary people, trapped in a world that asked too much and gave too little. Night in Victorian London arrived not with silence, but with a shifting of the city's tone. As the last hues of daylight drained from the sky, the lamps along the streets sputtered to life, their yellow glow struggling against the weight of fog. Shadows lengthened across cobblestones slick with rain, and the day's labor gave way to an entirely different kind of struggle, the business of surviving the night. For the wealthy, evenings promised warmth. Inside parlors decorated with velvet curtains and heavy drapes, gas lamps flickered across the polished wood of dining tables. Silverware clinked against porcelain as families gathered for multi-course dinners. Conversations turned to politics, theatre, and gossip from the court. Music drifted from pianos, played by daughters taught since childhood to master the art of refinement. Gentle laughter mingled with the faint scent of roasted meats and wine, a cocoon of comfort shielding them from the harsher world outside their door. But beyond those well-lit drawing rooms, the city hummed with another rhythm, narrow lanes filled with the cries of vendors selling roasted chestnuts or penny pies to anyone with a coin left to spare. Ragged children darted about, their bare feet slapping against stone, scavenging scraps from market stalls before the owners noticed. Women, shawls pulled tight against the damp air, lingered on street corners, their painted lips and weary eyes telling stories of necessity rather than choice. Theirs was an economy of survival, where hunger left little room for modesty or shame. In the rookeries, the overcrowded slums where entire families packed into single rooms, nightfall brought no rest. The air was thick with smoke from cheap fires, the floorboards crawling with vermin. 10, 12, even 15 people might share a single space. Bodies huddled together for warmth against the chill that seeped through broken windows. Privacy was non-existent. Coughs rattled in the dark, babies cried, and the drip of leaking roofs echoed into the silence between noises. It was in these same neighborhoods that crime blossomed with the night. Pickpockets worked in pairs, slipping through. Crowds with practiced ease. Gangs of boys as young as 12 prowled alleys, ready to steal a loaf of bread or a pocket watch. Not all theft was petty. Burglaries and assaults spiked under the cover of fog. The police force, still in its infancy, struggled to maintain order, their blue uniforms and rattles barely enough to deter hardened criminals. Justice, when it came, was harsh. Imprisonment in filthy jails, transportation to far-off colonies, or worse, entertainment offered another kind of darkness. Taverns filled with the clatter of mugs and the roar of drunken voices. Gin cheap, potent, and merciless, freely numbing hunger and despair. It was here that men gambled away wages, women sang for pennies, and disputes ended in bruises or blades. Music halls drew larger crowds, their stages bright with laughter and bawdy jokes. Yet even those theaters masked desperation. Many performers were poor themselves, their smiles plastered over debts and empty bellies. For children of the poor, the night was dangerous. Many roamed the streets as mudlarks, wading into the filthy Thames to search for scraps of coal, rope, or bone to sell. Others worked as match girls, carrying trays of matches through smoky taverns, inhaling toxic fumes that slowly ate away at their bones. Some simply wandered, curling into doorways when exhaustion overtook them. Countless were lost to hunger, illness, or the violence of the streets. They were ghosts of the empire, their names forgotten even as their small bodies fed the statistics of mortality that haunted every report on the poor. Meanwhile, in grander parts of the city, the upper classes entertained themselves in glittering ballrooms. Candlelight sparkled on crystal chandeliers, as couples waltzed across polished floors, gowns sweeping in waves of silk and lace. Gentlemen in tailored coats whispered promises or gossip into ears adorned with pearls. The music rose, triumphant and joyful, but even here shadows lingered. The wealth that paid for these evenings often came from factories staffed by children, from colonies where labor was extracted without mercy, or from investments that drained the lifeblood of workers whose names were never spoken in such company. The theater of respectability carried on late into the night. Men smoked cigars in drawing rooms, debating politics or boasting of business ventures, while women whispered in powder-scented boudoirs about marriages, dowries, and scandals. Yet cracks showed. Servants scurried in hallways, their ears catching fragments of secrets as they poured wine or collected coats. Behind every grand house was a network of invisible labor. Men and women who returned to damp basements at night, their hands blistered and their bodies aching, all for the sake of keeping appearances intact upstairs. Midnight in the city was not quiet. The clang of bells marked fires breaking out in crowded districts, flames leaping from roof to roof before exhausted fire brigades could tame them. The rattle of carriages carried aristocrats to private clubs where excess thrived behind closed doors. Beggars wrapped themselves in rags, pressing close to each other on church steps for warmth. Somewhere in the fog, a scream might echo, answered by silence as neighbors learned to look away rather than risk involvement. For those who lay awake in tenement rooms, the night was long. Rats scurried in the walls, water dripped from cracked ceilings, and the ache of empty stomachs gnawed more sharply in darkness. Mothers hummed lullabies to restless children, their voices soft and frayed, trying to soothe fears they themselves could not escape. Fathers rose before dawn to find work again, knowing rejection or grueling hours awaited them. Sleep, when it came, was shallow, interrupted by coughs, by dreams of better days, or by the harsh call of the morning bell demanding labor once more. The empire liked to imagine itself as a beacon of progress railways, science, literature, and innovation, lighting the path forward. Yet, in the deep hours of Victorian nights, the truth could not be polished away. Behind the grandeur lay suffering, and beneath the weight of respectability lay hunger and despair. The poor endured another night, and when the lamps flickered out and dawn crept in once more, the cycle began again. Morning in Victorian London did not bring the clean light of renewal. Instead, it revealed the scars left behind from the night. As the fog lifted, the filth of the streets was made visible again: horse dung, spilled refuse, and the soot that clung to every surface, blackening brick, skin, and lungs alike. The day began with the rattle of carts, the shouting of vendors, and the ceaseless clanging of factory bells, dragging men, women, and children into their daily toil. Factories stood like grim fortresses across the city, their chimneys coughing smoke into already heavy skies. From dawn to dusk, the air trembled with the pounding of machines. Inside, rows upon rows of workers bent over spinning frames, looms, or presses, their movements repetitive and unceasing. The din was deafening, a constant roar that drowned out conversation and thought alike. Men hunched in sweat-soaked shirts, their hands blistered from handling hot iron or rough cloth. Women stitched endlessly, fingers pricked and swollen, their backs aching from hours without relief. Children darted between machinery, small enough to slip beneath gears and belts, tasked with clearing blockages or collecting scraps. Many lost. Fingers, hands, or worse in the blur of turning wheels. The work was not just exhausting, it was dangerous. Dust from cotton clogged lungs, leading to a hacking cough that seldom left those who labored in textile mills. Miners descending deep into the earth with little light or safety, risked cave-ins and gas explosions each day. In match factories, young girls worked with phosphorus, their jaws slowly eaten away by the poison until faces became grotesque masks of suffering. Yet wages remained meager, barely enough to keep bread on the table, let alone afford proper shelter or medicine. Families were locked into a cruel arithmetic. More hours, more workers, more children sent to factories simply to keep starvation at bay. Education was, for many of the poor, a luxury beyond reach. While wealthier families boasted of tutors, governesses, and schools that instilled classical knowledge and refinement, the children of laborers often knew only the harsh discipline of the workplace. Literacy rates slowly improved, thanks to charitable schools and reformers. But for countless boys and girls, letters and numbers meant little compared to the daily necessity of survival. A book could not feed a hungry belly. Life outside the factories was hardly gentler. Streets bustled with hawkers selling cheap goods, cries of hot eels, fresh pies, and ribbons for a penny filling the air. Costermongers pushed carts of vegetables through alleys where sewage still ran in gutters, where the smell of rot mingled with coal smoke. Housewives haggled for scraps, clutching a few coins with which to stretch meals across the week. Children loitered barefoot, waiting for the chance to snatch fallen fruit or sift through garbage heaps. Beggars lined the roadsides, some missing limbs, others clutching infants. Each voice a reminder of how thin the line was between survival and ruin. The workhouse loomed as a constant threat, for families too destitute to manage the parish poor. Law offered a place within its walls, but at a price. Workhouses were designed not as havens, but as deterrents. Families were separated men from wives, children from mothers enforced into grueling labor in exchange for the barest rations of bread, gruel, and water. Clothing was coarse and identical, individuality stripped away. Within those walls, dignity was the first casualty. To enter the workhouse was to admit defeat, and most would exhaust every ounce of strength before surrendering to it. Disease stalked every alley, every cramped dwelling. Cholera swept through contaminated water supplies with brutal efficiency, striking without warning and leaving bodies piled high. Typhus thrived in filth, carried by lice across crowded beds. Tuberculosis lingered in damp rooms, a slow suffocation that consumed rich and poor alike, though the poor succumbed far more readily. Doctors were scarce, and medicine cost more than most could afford. Quack remedies flourished, hawked on street corners with bold claims but little effect. Death became an intimate companion, its presence felt in every household, its toll written into the lives of those left behind. And yet, amid the darkness, resilience shone stubbornly. In slums and crowded tenements, communities formed networks of mutual support. Women shared scraps of food with neighbors worse off than themselves. Men pooled wages when one of their number was injured. Children invented games out of scraps of wood or chalk marks on walls, laughter echoing in alleys even as hunger gnawed at their stomachs. Churches and charitable groups worked tirelessly, offering bowls of soup, bits of bread, or second-hand clothing to those who came through their doors. These small mercies stitched together lives that might otherwise have unraveled completely. The contrast between rich and poor was starkest in the broad avenues where carriages rattled past. There, occupants wrapped in furs and silks, oblivious or indifferent to the eyes that followed them from the pavements. The Victorian age prided itself on progress, invention, and morality, but the reality beneath the polished surface told a harsher story. Progress often meant profit for a few and pain for many. Invention filled the purses of industrialists while grinding down the bodies of their workers. Morality was loudly preached, yet poverty was treated as a personal failing rather than the result of systemic injustice. This was the daily reality of ordinary life, a pendulum swinging between survival and collapse, between labor and exhaustion, between the faint hope of better days and the crushing certainty that tomorrow would bring the same struggles anew. Each morning began with effort, each night ended in fatigue, and in between lay the relentless march of an empire built on the backs of those who were seldom remembered in its triumphs. As the day lengthened, the rhythm of Victorian life pressed onward with an unyielding regularity. For the poor, there was no pause to admire the achievements of the age, no time to linger in galleries or lecture halls. Instead, life unfolded. In cramped rooms where a family of 6 or more might huddle together in a single space, cooking, sleeping, and sometimes even working within the same 4 walls. These dwellings were often damp and crumbling, their ceilings low and beams warped with rot. Windows, if there were any, let in little light, and air was stifled with the smell of mildew, coal smoke, and unwashed bodies. Privacy was a foreign. Luxury, every sound, every cough, every sigh was shared, until one person's illness became everyone's burden. The landlords who owned such properties rarely set foot in them. They collected rent each week, sending agents door to door with ledgers and stern words for those in arrears. Tenants who could not pay were swiftly evicted, their meager belongings tossed into the street. It was a cycle as unrelenting as the factory bells work to earn, pay to live, fail to work, and lose the very roof overhead. For many, the constant threat of homelessness hung over their heads like a shadow, and the cold streets of London swallowed countless families who had fallen behind as evening crept in. The glow of gas lamps began to pierce the gathering gloom. The city shifted its character, revealing a darker underbelly. Taverns spilled laughter, curses, and songs into the streets, as men sought escape in mugs of ale and the temporary camaraderie of fellow laborers. The cheap drink dulled aching muscles and washed away, if only briefly, the bitterness of long days. Yet it also bred violence, as drunken arguments flared into brawls and homes suffered the brunt of husbands, returning with tempers ignited and pockets emptied. Women bore the weight of this domestic turbulence, their own hardships often silenced by fear or necessity. The night markets and narrow alleys drew another kind of trade, one seldom acknowledged in polite society, but woven deeply into the fabric of the Victorian city. Prostitutes, some scarcely older than girls, stood on corners or leaned in shadowed doorways, offering companionship to men of all classes. For many, it was not choice, but desperation that drove them to sell themselves. The wages of factory or domestic service could never stretch far enough, and the streets, dangerous as they were, offered a brutal kind of independence. Disease was rampant, spread from client to client, and the risk of violence was ever present. Yet for women with no other means, survival outweighed safety. Above these streets, in brightly lit theaters and music halls, another world existed. Audiences packed into balconies and boxes to watch singers, comedians, and dancers perform beneath gaslit chandeliers. Music halls became the heart of entertainment for the working class. Their songs body, their humor sharp, their atmosphere lively and electric. For a few hours, laughter could replace despair, and clapping hands could drown out the endless demands of work and poverty. Tickets were cheap enough that even the poor could occasionally scrape together the price, and within those crowded rooms, the hardships of daily life were forgotten, replaced by a chorus of voices singing in unison. But the contrast between the glittering stages and the grim alleys was more than symbolic. It was a reminder of the sharp divide that defined Victorian life. For the wealthy, evenings meant dinner, parties in homes glittering with crystal, silver, and conversation that stretched long into the night. Women in silk gowns with intricate lacework discussed novels or the latest scandal, while men debated politics, industry, and empire over glasses of brandy. Servants moved silently through these gatherings, unseen yet essential, their own labor providing the very comfort their masters enjoyed. The opulence of these dinners stood in harsh relief against the gruel served in the workhouses, yet both existed side by side, often within a mile of one another. For the poor, the end of the day meant collapsing into bediff. A bed could be had. Straw mattresses, crawling with lice, were shared by siblings or even strangers in the cheapest lodging houses. Tenements echoed with coughs, cries, and restless bodies shifting in the dark. Fires burned low or went out entirely, leaving families to huddle together for warmth. Hunger often followed them into sleep, gnawing at stomachs until dreams were broken by the pangs of want. Some sought solace in prayer, whispering words into the night, asking for mercy, strength, or simply one more day. Others relied only on sheer endurance, knowing tomorrow would bring the same weary routine. The city itself seemed to never sleep. Carriages rattled long after midnight, their wheels striking sparks against cobblestones. Night watchmen patrolled the streets, swinging lanterns and calling out the hours. Beggars curled in doorways, while thieves prowled alleys for unguarded purses or goods. Policemen, their tall helmets glinting in the dim light, marched there, beats with truncheons in hand, a visible reminder of order imposed upon chaos. Yet crime thrived despite them. Pickpockets moved with swift fingers through the crowds, gangs battled for territory, and the prisons swelled with those who had been caught, punished harshly for even the smallest offenses. This interplay of labor, poverty, survival, and fleeting escape formed the heartbeat of ordinary Victorian life. To live in such a world was to walk a narrow line between endurance and despair, where each day demanded every ounce of strength, and each night offered only the briefest reprieve. For all the grandeur associated with the Victorian age, inventions, the empire, the art and literature, was, for the majority, a life lived in struggle, where the shadows loomed far larger than the gaslit glow could ever dispel. As the hours pressed further into the night, the weight of the Victorian world grew heavier, almost oppressive, in the crowded alleys and soot-stained courtyards. Disease lingered like an uninvited guest in every breath of damp air. The streets of London and Manchester were lined with open gutters where refuse festered, and the sweet-sour stench of rotting food mingled with the unmistakable odor of human waste. In these conditions, cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis spread with terrifying ease. It was not uncommon for an illness to sweep through an entire street in a matter of weeks, claiming children first, then the frail and the elderly, until households were emptied of voices and the silence became unbearable. Doctors were few for the poor, and medicine was expensive. Families often turned instead to folk remedies, hoping herbs, poultices, or the prayers of a local healer could stem the relentless advance of sickness. Children were wrapped in cloths soaked with vinegar, fevers broken with cold water from the pump, or lungs soothed with honey and lemon, though rarely with lasting effect. Death came often, and it came swiftly. When a coffin was too costly, families wrapped the dead in sheets and carried them to common graves, where names were quickly forgotten. For mothers, the sound of an infant's cough, or the sight of a child growing pale carried with it a familiar dread, the knowledge that love alone could not shield their little ones from the diseases waiting just beyond the door. Even as the city fought these plagues, the pace of industrial life never faltered. Factory bells summoned workers at dawn and released them long after dusk, their shifts stretching 12 to 16 hours with little pause. Women and children bent over machines, their small fingers nimble enough to untangle threads or clear debris where adult hands could not fit. Accidents were common. A slip of concentration meant crushed limbs, severed fingers, or worse. Yet few could afford to leave. Injuries were endured as best they could, wrapped in cloth, hidden from overseers, or endured in silence until the heel door worsened. If a worker could no longer labor, they became a burden, easily replaced by another desperate soul waiting at the factory gate at night. When the machinery finally fell silent, its echoes remained inside the ears of those who had endured it, a phantom rhythm that followed them into their sleep. Bodies returned home weary, shoulders stooped, hands raw and blistered. Food was meager stews, stretched thin, bread often stale, meat a rare luxury. Many survived on tea and crusts of bread alone, their bodies sustained just enough to rise. Again the next morning, and repeat the cycle. The hunger was constant, gnawing at the ribs, and yet life pressed on. Families sang to their children to drown out the sounds of rumbling stomachs, offering lullabies instead of meals. Love in place of nourishment. For those without steady work, the night carried a different rhythm. Street corners became stages where men sold matches, polished shoes, or cried out the latest headlines for pennies. Children, barefoot and hungry, darted between carts, snatching scraps or begging passers-by for coins. Some were drawn into the city's shadow economy, running messages for criminals or selling stolen goods. For them, the night was both dangerous and alive, a test of cunning and courage that often determined whether they ate or starved. The workhouses loomed as a last resort, their high walls and iron gates a constant reminder of what awaited the destitute. Inside, men and women were separated, families broken apart as punishment for their poverty. Food was gruel, thin and flavorless, doled out in silence beneath the watchful eyes of overseers. Labor was relentless, breaking stones, picking oakum, or scrubbing floors until hands cracked and bled. The workhouse stripped away identity, dignity, and hope, leaving only weary figures bent beneath the weight of survival. To enter was to surrender, and to many it was a fate worse than death. Yet even in this harshness, there were sparks of resilience that refused to be extinguished. Neighbors often cared for one another in ways that official institutions would. Not a mother might share a loaf of bread with a family whose father had been injured. A widow might watch over children while their mother worked long hours at a laundry. In taverns, men sang together, their voices rising above the misery, weaving songs that spoke of endurance, laughter, and fleeting joy. In churches, prayers rose in unison, blending the voices of the weary into something greater than themselves. A collective cry for mercy, for hope, for the possibility of a better tomorrow. The wealthier classes, ensconced in their warm drawing, Rooms seldom glimpsed these struggles directly, though the cries of the poor were never far from their doors. The wail of a child outside the window, the sight of ragged figures huddled by the steps, the smell of sewage drifting in through the open carriage. These were constant reminders that the empire's splendor was built upon the backs of millions, living lives of quiet desperation. Yet society preferred to look away, to hide its shame behind heavy curtains and polished silver. And still, the night deepened, pressing itself against the fragile walls of tenements and the glittering windows of mansions alike. The Victorian city breathed in suffering and exhaled survival. Its rhythm relentless, its heart beating with both grandeur and despair. For those who lived it, the darkness of the night was more than the absence of sunlight. It was a test of endurance, a mirror of society's failures, and a reminder that beneath the surface of progress, the cost of civilization was often measured in human lives. As the night stretched toward its slow decline, the rhythm of Victorian life did not ease. For many, there was no true rest, only short, fitful hours stolen between responsibilities. In the crowded tenements, sleep came in fragments, broken by the cry of a child, the clatter of rats moving across floorboards, or the coughing of a neighbor whose sickness seeped through thin walls. Families often slept piled together for warmth, bodies pressed close against the winter chill that crept. Through cracks in the windows and under the door, the meager heat of a dying coal fire, if they had one at all, rarely lasted past midnight, and the cold bit at fingers and toes until the morning light returned. Women, even after long hours of factory or domestic labor, remained awake longer than most. By dim candlelight, they mended clothes, scrubbed stains from garments to make them last another season, or prepared what little food could be stretched into tomorrow's meals. Their hands never seemed to rest, even in exhaustion. They found themselves working into the hours when others slept. These unseen labors were the thread that kept families together, and without them, survival would have been nearly impossible. In contrast, those living in wealth found their nights luxuriously padded with comfort. Gas lamps lit their parlors, with warm glow, and fires roared in polished hearths, turning shadows into soft orange hues. They dined late, often on rich meats, wines, and desserts that the working class could only dream of. Music played in drawing rooms, pianos filling the air with melodies that drowned out the city's outside cries. Yet even among the wealthy, unease sometimes lingered. The darkness beyond their windows reminded them that their world rested on precarious foundations, built upon the endless labor of those who trudged through soot and hardship for a fraction of what they themselves enjoyed. Meanwhile, outside on the streets, the city never fully slept. Night watchmen patrolled with lanterns, their steady steps echoing in alleys where thieves and cut-purses waited for opportunity, the gaslights lining. The main thoroughfares provided pools of faint security, but beyond their reach, shadows cloaked hidden dangers. Women walking alone risked harassment, and men staggering home from taverns risked more than an empty pocket if they turned down the wrong lane. The night belonged to those willing to take risks, and in the twisting backstreets of Victorian cities, survival was often a game of luck. For the homeless, there was no escape from the cold or the dangers of the night. Children curled beneath stairwells, their thin coats pulled tight, while men and women leaned against walls, seeking any semblance of shelter from the wind. They might cluster together for warmth, sharing scraps of food or simply the comfort of being near another human being. Yet they were often chased off by constables who considered them nuisances rather than victims. Their lives played out in a cycle of endurance. Their stories largely invisible to those who lived in warmth and safety. In the poorer districts, the sounds of the city's underground economy thrived after midnight. Taverns remained loud and boisterous, filled with workers spending their last pennies on cheap ale that numbed the body and softened the hardships of the day. Brothels whispered with business, offering both fleeting escape and further despair. Gamblers hunched over dice and cards in hidden corners, chasing fortunes that so often ended in greater ruin. For these souls, the night was not for rest, but for pursuit of pleasure, of distraction, of survival in whatever form it could be seized. As dawn began its slow approach, faint light creeping above chimneys and rooftops, the city stirred once more. The night's secrets faded into the pale blue of early morning, yet its weight remained. For the poor, the new day brought no relief, only the return of the endless cycle. Work awaited, hunger persisted, sickness lingered. For the wealthy, the morning offered fresh leisure. Breakfast laid neatly on tables, sunlight filtering through clean curtains. The divide between these worlds remained stark, visible in every glance, in every street, in every breath. The Victorian night was not simply a passage of hours. It was a mirror of inequality, a stage where survival played out in countless forms. It revealed the resilience of the human spirit and the cruelty of a society that allowed so many to struggle in silence. As the city awoke once more, the echoes of the night did not vanish. They lingered, etched into weary bodies, into the walls of the tenements, into the very rhythm of life itself. The dawn of a Victorian morning carried with it a deceptive kind of promise. The streets, once cloaked in shadows and danger, began to stir with a different sort of life. Chimneys coughed up fresh plumes of smoke, horses clattered across cobblestones, and vendors pushed their carts laden with bread or fish, their voices cutting through the crisp air. To a passerby, the city might appear alive with opportunity, bustling with energy and possibility. Yet beneath this outward rhythm, the same harsh realities that ruled the night continued, unbroken and unforgiving. Children woke first in many households, pulled from shallow sleep to contribute to the daily grind. In working-class homes, young boys and girls tugged on patched clothes and hurried toward factories, mills, or the streets where they sold matches, newspapers, or flowers. Their small feet moved quickly, their eyes heavy with fatigue, their futures already chained to labor, before they had even begun to dream of more. Childhood, as we understand it today, scarcely existed for them. Instead, survival demanded that even the youngest carry a share of the burden, often under conditions that crushed spirits before they had the chance to grow. Factories themselves were monsters of industry, roaring to life as morning light seeped through the city's haze. Tall chimneys belched smoke into the sky, and inside, machines clattered with deafening force. Men, women, and children alike stood at their stations, fingers nimble, bodies bent, hours stretching endlessly ahead. The danger was constant: gears that caught loose clothing, air that filled lungs with dust and fibers, floors slick with oil that sent workers tumbling. Injuries were commonplace, and yet compensation was rare. If a worker lost a hand, a leg, or even their life, there was always another desperate soul waiting to fill the vacant spot. For women in particular, the day was a relentless balancing act. Many worked outside the home, in factories, laundries, or as maids in wealthier households. But upon returning, the demands of domestic life still awaited them. They cooked, cleaned, mended, and nursed, often with little acknowledgement of the double weight they carried. The idealized image of the angel in the house was pressed upon them, a vision of the dutiful, self-sacrificing wife and mother. Yet for the vast majority of women, reality was not poetry but exhaustion, their lives stitched together by the invisible thread of necessity in stark contrast. The day for the wealthy unfolded with leisure. Sunlight poured through tall windows of townhouses and country estates, illuminating polished furniture and gleaming silverware. Breakfasts consisted of eggs, meats, teas, and jams, a far cry from the thin gruel or stale bread consumed by the working poor. Well-dressed gentlemen left for offices or clubs, while women tended to the orchestration of the household, often through the labor of servants whose own lives were marked by long hours and little pay. In the afternoons, carriages rolled down the streets toward shopping districts or public gardens, their passengers adorned in fine fabrics that spoke not only of wealth but of status and security. This divide was not lost on those who lived within it. The poor often looked upward with a mix of resentment and longing, while the rich cast downward glances tinged with suspicion, pity, or indifference. The gulf between these worlds was reinforced by law, by culture, and by the invisible, yet powerful, weight of class. It dictated where one lived, what one ate, how one dressed, and even how long one could expect to live. To be born into poverty in the Victorian era was, in many ways, to be condemned to it. No matter how hard one worked or how fervently one dreamed, the streets during the day reflected this duality. On one hand, they were lively vendors, hawking goods, children darting between horses, beggars calling out for coins. On the other, they carried the stench of waste, the press of overcrowding, and the tension of so many lives struggling against the limits of circumstance. Disease spread easily in such environments, carried in contaminated water, uncollected refuse, and the simple closeness of bodies packed too tightly together. Cholera, typhoid, and tuberculosis lurked in the background of daily life, claiming, lives quietly yet relentlessly. For those who sought escape from this weight, the city offered small reprieves. Public parks, though not always accessible to the poorest, provided green spaces where children played and couples strolled. Music halls and theaters lured crowds with laughter and song, offering brief distraction from the grind of reality. Even the pubs, smoky and loud, were places of temporary refuge, where ale dulled hunger and laughter softened the edge of despair. But these escapes were fleeting, and when the show ended or the mug was emptied, the truth of daily life waited just outside the door. At its core, the Victorian day was one of contradiction. It was an era that prided itself on progress, on innovation, on moral ideals. Yet behind the inventions and the polished image lay human lives frayed by poverty, inequality, and relentless toil. The very same sun that glinted off the windows of grand houses also illuminated the sweat-streaked faces of children working in mills, the weary eyes of women carrying too much, and the bent backs of men whose strength was consumed by machines. And so, as the city moved through its hours of light, the dark side of Victorian life did not recede. It simply shifted shape, woven into the fabric of daily existence. Night might have hidden some of its cruelties in shadow, but the day laid them bare for anyone willing to see. Doctors of the Victorian age carried themselves with authority, their black bags and stiff collars projecting an image of competence. Yet for most ordinary people, medicine was far from a guarantee of healing. Hospitals were crowded, unsanitary places, often avoided unless one had no other choice. For the poor, The workhouse infirmary was the last resort, and entering it meant not only surrendering to sickness, but also accepting the stigma of failure. These institutions were feared as much as the diseases they sought to treat, places where one might go in and never come out again. Medicine itself was in a strange state, perched between old superstitions and modern science. Some doctors prescribed bleeding or purging, clinging to outdated notions of balancing humors. Others embraced newer practices, experimenting with anesthetics or antiseptics that were just beginning to gain traction. But for many patients, the treatments were as dangerous as the illnesses. Opiates like laudanum were handed out freely, prescribed for everything from headaches to teething pains in infants, creating quiet epidemics of addiction. Patent medicines, advertised in newspapers with bold promises, were mixtures of alcohol, morphine, and mysterious powders, offering comfort in the moment, but little true cure. For women, medical treatment was deeply entangled with the rigid gender norms of the era. A woman suffering from depression, exhaustion, or anxiety might be diagnosed with hysteria, a catch-all condition supposedly rooted in her weaker female constitution. Treatments ranged from bed rest to bizarre electrical devices, often ignoring the true causes of suffering, poverty, overwork, or abuse. Childbirth, too, remained perilous. Though advances were slowly being made, many women entered labor knowing that survival was far from guaranteed, and that infection or hemorrhage might claim their lives. Children bore their own heavy burdens in this world of fragile health. Malnutrition was rampant, with thin soups and stale bread doing little to fuel growing bodies. Diseases such as measles, scarlet fever, and diphtheria swept through households, taking the youngest with merciless efficiency. The death of a child was a tragedy, but it was also heartbreakingly common, so common that some families avoided, becoming too attached until a child survived past infancy. Tiny coffins were a grim reality for undertakers, their trade booming in a society where death hovered close at hand. The paradox was sharpest in the upper classes, where wealth provided access to better doctors, healthier diets, and cleaner living conditions. Yet even there, the dark side lingered. Women of status often wore tight corsets that constricted their ribs and compressed their lungs, leaving them breathless and faint. Arsenic was used in cosmetics, slowly poisoning the very women who sought to enhance their beauty. Even the well-off could fall prey to the dangers hidden in plain sight, the pursuit of appearance proving just as lethal as poverty's grip. Sanitation, or rather the lack of it, was perhaps the most decisive factor in health. Sewers overflowed, rivers carried filth, and water pumps drew from contaminated sources. The infamous Great Stink of 1858, when the Thames reeked so badly that Parliament could not meet, was only one moment in an ongoing crisis of pollution. Cholera outbreaks struck with sudden ferocity, killing thousands and spreading fear across the city. It took years before authorities accepted that contaminated water, not bad air, was to blame a delay that cost countless lives. Philanthropy emerged in response to these horrors, though it often carried a tone of moral judgment. Wealthy benefactors established hospitals, orphanages, and charities, but help was often conditional, tied to expectations of obedience and virtue. The poor were not simply fed, they were lectured, scolded, or disciplined, as though poverty itself were a moral failing. Even in the act of giving, society reinforced the hierarchy between those who had and those who had not. Still, amid the cruelty and neglect, there were glimmers of progress. The pioneering work of Florence Nightingale and others began to reshape nursing, bringing cleanliness and compassion into the field of care. Public health reforms, however slow, gradually took shape, laying the groundwork for safer water and improved housing. But for the ordinary Victorian, these improvements arrived too late to save the loved ones already buried in crowded churchyards, or the countless unnamed whose lives were lost in silence. The day might have been filled with the sounds of industry and commerce, but beneath that hum lay a quieter struggle, the fragile fight of bodies against disease, hunger, and despair. In parlors and tenements, in hospitals and factories, health was not a guarantee but a gamble, and for many, the odds were stacked cruelly against them. The irony of Victorian life was this: in an age of innovation and discovery, where railways spanned the country and telegraphs sent words flying through wires, human survival often depended on the most basic needs: clean water, nourishing food, safe shelter, needs that remained out of reach for so many, no matter how modern the world around them appeared. If one word defined Victorian society, it was respectability. It shaped how people dressed, how they spoke, how they moved through public space. To be seen as respectable was to have a shield against suspicion, a fragile shield that could crack with a single misstep. For the middle classes especially, the pursuit of appearances became a constant, exhausting performance. Men wore stiff collars and somber suits, their posture erect, their manners deliberate. Women, cloaked in layered gowns, were taught to glide rather than walk, to sit gracefully even when corsets pinched their ribs. Children too were drawn into this theatre of appearances, their clothes pressed, their lessons memorized, their manners rehearsed for neighbors and visitors. Every act was a declaration. We are not poor, we are not vulgar, we are not to be looked down upon. Yet beneath this polished surface, hypocrisies thrived. Respectability was not the same as morality. A gentleman might appear upright in society while quietly indulging in drinking, gambling, or visiting the city's brothels. A lady might preside over charitable events, distributing food to the poor while treating her servants with cold cruelty behind closed doors. The facade mattered more than the truth, and as long as one maintained it, society looked the other way. For women, the demands of respectability were especially suffocating. Their role was defined by purity, obedience, and domestic grace. They were expected to be angels in the house, loyal wives, devoted mothers, keepers of morality. Yet this ideal ignored the reality of women's lives, many of whom were overworked, uneducated, or trapped in loveless marriages. Divorce was rare, scandalous, and almost impossible for women to pursue without destroying their reputation. Those who stepped outside the narrow bounds of propriety risked being labeled fallen, a word that could strip them of all social standing. Men, by contrast, lived with far greater leniency. The same society that condemned a woman for impropriety often shrugged when a man pursued vices in the shadows. Brothels flourished in Victorian London, with thousands of women and girls forced into sex work by poverty. The very men who lectured on morality in Parliament or preached chastity in church were often those who kept these businesses alive. It was an open secret, whispered about but rarely confronted. The contradiction between public virtue and private vice was one of the most striking features of the age. Religion reinforced much of this moral code, but even there, the lines were blurred. Sunday sermons thundered about sin, while pews were filled with congregants who turned a blind eye to the suffering around them. The poor were judged not only for their lack of money, but also for their supposed lack of discipline. A man who could not support his family was often condemned as lazy, even if he worked from dawn to dusk in conditions that drained his strength. A woman who begged on the street might be called shameless, while those who scorned her passed by without lifting a finger. Children, too, bore the weight of appearances. Families who could not afford fine clothes still scrubbed and patched garments to present a clean face to the world. To appear ragged was to invite judgment, even pity, and pity in Victorian society was often sharp-edged, laced with disdain. Middle-class children were pushed to study, recite poetry, and learn the piano, not always for their own sake, but to signal refinement to others. Respectability was a performance played out across every layer of society, even when survival itself was at stake. This obsession with image extended to death. Mourning was not simply grief, but a ritualized display. Families spent beyond their means to purchase black clothing, funeral carriages, and elaborate headstones, all to show that their loss was met with dignity. A widow might wear mourning clothes for years, signaling her devotion and propriety, regardless of her private feelings. Even in grief, appearances reigned supreme. And yet, the pressure of this endless performance left scars. Many lived with a constant fear of scandal, terrified that gossip might ruin their standing. A single rumor could undo years of careful effort, and the rigid social hierarchy left little room for redemption. The result was a society that prized appearances above compassion, reputation above truth. The gap between public virtue and private reality yawned wide, swallowing countless lives into silence. For those who could not play the game, there was little mercy. Servants who lost their positions, women who bore children out of wedlock, men who fell into debt, all risked being cast adrift. Respectability was not only a shield, but also a weapon, used to exclude and condemn, the very ideal that bound. Society together also tore it apart, leaving scars that the fine clothes and polite manners could never fully conceal. In the end, Victorian respectability was a mask, polished, rigid, and fragile. It concealed the cracks beneath, but it also demanded obedience to an exhausting performance. And behind those polite smiles, behind those stiff collars and whispered prayers, lay a truth far darker, that in a world obsessed with appearances, humanity itself often came second. If the drawing rooms and parlors of the Victorian middle class were defined by etiquette and propriety, the streets of the city told a different story. London, Manchester, Liverpool, and other growing cities became breeding grounds for crime. The swelling population, the crushing poverty, and the stark inequality created a world where theft, prostitution, and vice became part of the urban rhythm. In the dark alleys and back streets, pickpockets moved with astonishing skill, slipping purses from coats and coins from pockets before vanishing into the crowd. Street children, often no older than 10, learned to survive through quick hands and quicker escapes. Some were organized into gangs, led by older boys or criminals who taught them the trade. The police force, still relatively new and often underfunded, struggled to keep up. The thin blue line of Victorian constables could not match the sheer desperation of those who had nothing to lose. Prostitution, perhaps the most haunting element of Victorian crime, was everywhere. Brothels operated openly. In many districts, their business sustained by men from all walks of life. Laborers, clerks, even aristocrats. Officially, society condemned prostitution as immoral. Unofficially, it tolerated and even depended upon it. Thousands of women and girls, some barely into their teens, were forced into the trade by poverty, abandoned by families, or lured with promises of work that ended in exploitation. Reformers spoke of the fallen woman, but their sympathy often carried blame. Prostitutes were both pitied and scorned, viewed as victims of circumstance, yet treated as moral failures. The hypocrisy was staggering. Men who sought their services rarely faced the same judgment. For the women, the risks were enormous: disease, violence, arrest, and social exile. Once labeled fallen, there was little chance of climbing back. Drunkenness added to the city's dangers. Gin houses and taverns lined the streets, offering cheap escape from grim reality. Entire families sometimes drank themselves into stupors, their wages poured into bottles instead of food. Reform movements, like the temperance societies, railed against alcohol, painting it as the root of crime and poverty. And while drink did ruin lives, the deeper truth was that despair, hunger, and hopelessness often drove people to it in the first place. The Victorian obsession with crime also gave rise to a dark fascination. Newspapers printed lurid accounts of murders, robberies, and scandals, feeding a public appetite for tales of the criminal underworld. Sensational crimes became national talking points, their details dissected in pubs and parlors alike. The most notorious of all came in the late Victorian era, when Jack the Ripper stalked the streets of Whitechapel, preying on women whose lives had already been chewed by poverty. The killings terrified London, but they also revealed the grim indifference toward the poor until violence forced attention. Prisons, too, reflected the contradictions of the age. Built to reform as well as punish, they imposed rigid discipline, silence, isolation, hard labor. Prisoners spent hours in back-breaking work or pacing in enforced solitude. Reformers argued this would break bad habits and instill morality, but in truth it often broke spirits instead. For many, prison was not a turning point, but part of a cycle. Driven by poverty and desperation, the criminal world also had its own codes and networks. Thieves, kitchens, meeting places for criminals, provided protection and camaraderie for those on the wrong side of the law. Stolen goods flowed through shadowy markets, and bribery sometimes kept the authorities at bay. The law itself could be inconsistent, harsher on the poor than on the wealthy. A starving man caught stealing bread might face months of imprisonment, while a gentleman guilty of fraud could escape with a fine. Justice was often less about crime and more about class, and yet, for all its horrors, the Victorian underworld was also a reflection of survival. Those who stole, begged, or sold themselves did so not out of pure vice, but because the system left them no choice. When workhouses loomed as the alternative, grim institutions that stripped people of dignity, the shadows of crime seemed too many. The lesser evil, the darkness of Victorian life, was not just in the alleyways, the brothels, or the gin houses. It was in the hypocrisy of a society that preached virtue while tolerating vice, that punished the desperate while excusing the privileged. The underworld did not exist in isolation. It was woven into the fabric of Victorian society itself, a mirror of the inequalities that polite drawing rooms tried so hard to ignore. In this way, crime in the Victorian era was more than a matter of law and order. It was the shadow cast by respectability, the other half of a society obsessed with appearances. Behind the facades of refinement, the whispers of scandal and the cries of the poor told the real story of what it meant to live in this gilded but haunted age. Victorian life was lived under the constant shadow of death, the glittering progress of industry, the elegance of parlors, and the grandeur of empire could not mask the fragility of existence in an age when medicine lagged far behind the needs of a booming population. Infant mortality was heartbreakingly common. Parents often buried children before they reached their first birthdays. Diseases such as tuberculosis, cholera, typhus, and scarlet fever stalked the streets, claiming lives. With terrifying regularity, the very air could kill. In cities, thick smoke from factories mingled with coal dust from chimneys, producing a smog that choked lungs and dimmed the sun. Children grew up breathing this foul air, their bodies stunted and their health weakened. The rivers that flowed through towns were often little more than open sewers, carrying human waste and industrial runoff side by side. The Thames in London, at the height of the 19th century, reeked so badly that it was said to drive lawmakers from Parliament. In these waters, cholera thrived, sweeping through crowded neighborhoods without warning. Doctors of the early Victorian age often did more harm than good. Before the discovery of germs, disease was still blamed on bad air or moral failings. Treatments ranged from the ineffective to the dangerous, bleeding, purging, and doses of mercury. Surgery was performed without anesthesia until the mid-century. And even after chloroform and ether were introduced, the lack of sterile practice made hospitals deadly places. Infection killed far more than the knife. For many, staying away from doctors was as much a survival tactic as seeking their help. And yet, despite death's grim regularity, the Victorians did not look away. They confronted mortality with a mix of fear, ritual, and strange fascination. Death became a spectacle woven deeply into culture. Families held elaborate mourning rituals, draping homes in black and observing strict codes of dress. A widow might spend years clothed only in heavy mourning garments, signaling her grief to the world. Black crepe, jet jewelry, and veils became symbols of loss, but also of social respectability. Funerals were grand affairs, even for the poor. To give a loved one a proper burial, families would save for years or plunge into debt, hiring horses, carriages, and professional mourners to follow the coffin. Undertakers staged processions designed not only to honor the dead, but to signal the family's standing in the community. Death was not hidden away. It was paraded through the streets. Perhaps most striking of all was the Victorian fascination. With death, photography, families would pose with deceased children or relatives, dressing them in their finest clothes and arranging them as though asleep. These haunting images served as both remembrance and comfort, the only portraits some families would ever have of their loved ones. To modernize, it may appear macabre, but to Victorians, it was an act of love in a world where death arrived too, often too soon. Alongside these rituals, the spiritualist movement gained enormous popularity. Seances, mediums, and ghostly communications captivated people desperate for contact with lost loved ones. Even the wealthy and educated were drawn into this world, attending parlors where tables were said to move and spirits tapped messages from beyond. Some were true believers, others skeptics. But in an age of uncertainty, the idea of bridging the gap between life and death was irresistible. Children grew up steeped in this culture of mortality. They played among graveyards, where space was so scarce that bodies were often stacked one atop another, and fresh earth gave up the stench of decay. Cemeteries, though grim, were also places of family visits, Sunday walks, and even picnics. Death was both terrifying and familiar, woven into the fabric of everyday life in ways that seem almost unimaginable now. The Victorians' obsession with death reflected both their vulnerability and their longing for control. In a time when medicine offered few protections, ritual and symbolism gave meaning to loss. Mourning attire, photographs, elaborate funerals. These were not just customs, but ways of asserting dignity in the face of fragility. If they could not master death, they could at least shape how it was seen. Yet for all its pageantry, the ever-present reality of mortality haunted Victorian minds. Children who survived illnesses might be scarred for life. Adults lived with a constant fear of epidemics. Women faced danger with every pregnancy. The line between life and death was thinner, closer, more immediate than anything we imagine today. And so, the dark side of Victorian life was not only the poverty of the slums, or the vice of the underworld, but the unrelenting presence of death itself, always near, always demanding to be acknowledged. The Victorians lived at a crossroads of knowledge, an age when scientific progress coexisted with deep-rooted superstition. Death was not only a personal tragedy, but also a subject of fascination, study, and, sometimes, exploitation. This was an era when bodies were prized not only for mourning, but for medicine, religion, and even profit. One of the most unsettling practices of the period was body snatching. Medical schools needed cadavers to teach anatomy, yet the law permitted only the dissection of executed criminals. As executions declined, demand outstripped supply. Into this gap stepped grave robbers, who dug up fresh corpses under cover of night to sell them to surgeons. It became such a problem that families resorted to iron coffins, guarded graveyards, and even watchmen with guns to protect the newly dead. Some cemeteries installed mort safes, heavy cages over graves designed to thwart robbers. The thought of a loved one's body being stolen and dissected horrified families. Yet the thriving market endured until laws finally expanded legal access to cadavers. Medicine itself was straddling the line between breakthrough and barbarism. Dissections, once considered sinful, gradually became respectable, even vital, to understanding the body. Yet for ordinary Victorians, the idea of the body being cut open after death could feel like a second violation. Autopsies were conducted, with little regard for consent, and the poor were especially vulnerable. Workhouse inmates, whose families could not afford burials, often had their bodies claimed by medical institutions, sparking outrage and fear at the same time. Pseudosciences flourished. Phrenology, the belief that the shape of the skull revealed character and destiny, became wildly popular. Learned men and women would run their fingers along bumps on the head, claiming to read intelligence, morality, and even criminal tendencies. Parlors displayed phrenological charts, and people lined up to have their mental faculties mapped, though modern science dismisses it entirely. In Victorian times, it was considered cutting-edge, a way of peering into the mysteries of the human soul through the body. The Victorians were also fascinated by the supernatural, a fascination intensified by grief and high mortality. Mediums promised to summon spirits, producing table-rapping ghostly voices, and even apparitions in darkened rooms. Seances became a fashionable pastime, attended by both the wealthy and the working class. Some participants were genuine believers, while others went out of curiosity or even for entertainment. The line between science and illusion blurred, as photographs of spirits circulated, ethereal, translucent figures captured alongside the living. Though many were proven frauds, the desire to believe in life after death was too strong to dismiss entirely. Even in the realm of mourning, superstition reigned. Curtains were drawn, mirrors covered, and clocks stopped when death entered the home. It was believed that a mirror left uncovered might trap the soul of the deceased, or that a stopped clock marked the boundary between life and death, family. Photographs sometimes included subtle symbols of loss: a black ribbon pinned on a lapel, a flower wilting in the corner of the frame. These small details conveyed grief to those who understood their coded language. For children, these customs became lessons in mortality. They were taught that death was not only an end, but a transformation, surrounded by rituals and signs. Fairy tales and moral stories reinforced the idea that good children went to heaven, while bad behavior might lead to punishment in the afterlife. In many ways, childhood was steeped in both fear and comfort, preparing young minds to accept death as a natural, if tragic, part of life. The intersection of death and commerce was also impossible to ignore. The mourning industry boomed, with entire businesses devoted to funeral clothing, caskets, and accessories. Mourning jewelry, often made from jet or even woven from the hair of the deceased, became treasured heirlooms. Shops offered custom-made mourning stationery, black-edged cards for correspondence, and even mourning toys for children who had lost siblings. Death had become not only a spiritual matter, but an economic one, shaping industries that profited from grief. This blending of science, superstition, and commerce revealed much about the Victorian psyche. They were people caught between fear and curiosity, tradition and progress. On one hand, they sought rational explanations for disease and death. On the other, they turned to seances and symbols for comfort. The human body, in both life and death, became a stage upon which these contradictions played out. Perhaps most telling was how Victorians could hold both extremes at once. A grieving family might hire a photographer to capture the likeness of their dead child, then later attend a séance to hear the child's spirit speak. A doctor might dissect bodies in the name of science, then return home to a household where mirrors were shrouded and clocks stopped for the latest funeral. Death was both a subject of serious study and a constant reminder of mystery. And so, the dark side of Victorian life extended beyond poverty, disease, or even death itself. It reached into the strange rituals, beliefs, and practices that shaped how Victorians coped with the inevitable. Their obsession with mortality was not merely about loss, but about finding meaning in the face of uncertainty. A fragile balance between reason and reverence, science and superstition. To walk through a Victorian cemetery is to step into a city of the dead. These were not the cramped, chaotic graveyards of earlier centuries, where bodies were stacked upon one another without order. Instead, they were carefully planned, landscaped spaces, part garden, part shrine, part public park. Death was not hidden away but displayed in full view, carved into stone and arranged in rows, like streets of silence. The 19th century saw an explosion of what became known as the Garden Cemetery. London alone gave rise to the magnificent 7 vast cemeteries built outside the crowded city to accommodate the growing number of burials. These were more than places to inter the dead. They were designed as serene escapes from industrial smoke and squalor. Families could stroll among winding paths, sit on benches shaded by ancient trees, and visit their loved ones beneath monuments carved with angels, crosses, and poetic inscriptions. Monuments themselves became statements of grief, wealth, and social rank. The poor might only afford a simple stone or wooden cross, but the wealthy erected grand mausoleums, obelisks, and statues of weeping figures draped in classical robes. Some tombs resembled miniature temples, complete with columns and domes, proclaiming not only the memory of the deceased, but the family's enduring prestige. Even in death, class distinctions were impossible to ignore. Yet behind the beauty of these cemeteries lay darker truths. They were necessary because traditional graveyards in cities were overflowing, their soil packed with centuries of corpses. Disease was often blamed on the miasmas rising from churchyards, and reformers pushed for more hygienic, orderly spaces. The creation of garden cemeteries solved a public health crisis, while simultaneously reshaping cultural attitudes toward death. Now, mourning could be public, picturesque, even leisurely. A visit to the cemetery became a regular outing, especially on Sundays. Families would dress in their finest mourning clothes and walk among the monuments, tending to graves with flowers or wreaths. For some, these visits provided comfort. For others, they became opportunities to see and be seen, turning the cemetery into a curious blend of sacred space and social stage. Newspapers at the time even described fashionable women strolling among the headstones as though they were promenading through a park. The Victorians also infused their cemeteries with symbolism. Ivy represented eternal life. Broken columns signified a life cut short. Clasped hands carved into tombstones symbolize farewell or reunion in the afterlife. Angels pointed heavenward. Urns wept draped with stone cloths, and lambs marked the graves of children. These visual codes turned burial grounds into vast storybooks, where each symbol whispered of grief, hope, or resignation. But cemeteries were not only places of memory, they were also landscapes of fear. Tales abounded of ghosts lingering among the graves, of mourners who claimed to see pale figures drifting between mausoleums, or of strange sounds echoing after nightfall. The very design of Victorian cemeteries, with shadowed corners, Gothic monuments, and creeping ivy, lent itself to the imagination. To wander alone after dark was to invite chills and whispers of the uncanny. And then there was the Victorian obsession with being buried alive. Advances in medicine had not eliminated uncertainty about the moment of death. Stories circulated of people awakening in coffins, clawing desperately at the wood until it was too late. To prevent this dreaded fate, some Victorians commissioned safety coffins equipped with bells, flags, or breathing tubes. A string might be tied to the corpse's finger, connected to a bell above ground, so that if the person stirred, they could signal for rescue. Though rare, the fear of premature burial haunted the Victorian imagination, adding another layer of unease to the cemetery landscape. The sheer scale of mourning architecture extended beyond cemeteries into cities themselves. Funeral processions, clogged narrow streets with long lines of black-plumed horses drawing hearses draped in velvet. Onlookers gathered to watch, judging the grandeur of the display. Elaborate funerals were not only tributes to the dead, but public performances of wealth and respectability. The size of the cortege, the richness of the coffin, and even the number of mourners were measured as indicators of social worth. And yet, despite all the grandeur, cemeteries also bore witness to forgotten lives. Rows of unmarked graves held the bodies of the poor, buried in communal plots without headstones or ceremony. Their silence contrasted starkly with the towering monuments of the wealthy, reminding visitors that even in the democracy of death, inequality persisted. To the modern visitor, Victorian cemeteries may seem eerie, even beautiful. But to those who lived in that age, they were part of the fabric of life, places where memory, status, and superstition intertwined. They stood as monuments not only to individuals, but to an entire culture that could not let death pass quietly. And so, the cemetery became a mirror of Victorian society, structured, unequal, haunted by fear, yet draped in beauty. To walk among the graves was to walk through a map of Victorian values, their grief etched in stone, their anxieties hidden beneath. Flowers, their contradictions carved into every symbol. When we think of the Victorian era, it is tempting to picture a golden age of invention, literature, and empire. We remember Dickens and Darwin, Queen Victoria's long reign, the Great Exhibition beneath the glittering glass of the Crystal Palace. We imagine candlelit parlors with velvet curtains, gentlemen in top hats, and ladies in bustled gowns sipping tea. And yes, all of that existed. But alongside it, in the shadows of gaslit streets, there was another reality, the one people preferred not to talk about, the one hidden behind lace curtains and soot-blackened walls. This darker side of Victorian life was woven into everyday existence. It was the smell of open sewers in crowded slums, the hacking cough of tuberculosis echoing through tenement halls, the endless funerals of children who never saw adulthood. It was women trapped in corsets and societal expectations, factory workers, bent double over machines, and chimney sweeps who grew old before they turned 20. It was mothers donning mourning clothes again and again, until black silk became as familiar as breathing. And yet, for all its hardships, the Victorian age was not merely a story of suffering. It was also an age of resilience. People created rituals, symbols, and traditions to cope with the inevitability of death. They found beauty in mourning, building cemeteries that were part garden, part cathedral, where memory could live in stone. They whispered their grief through photographs of the dead, portraits meant to hold on to faces that time would otherwise erase. They navigated superstition and science, straddling a world of seances and telegrams, of ghost stories and industrial progress. What makes this era so haunting is not only its contrasts, but its familiarity. The Victorians feared disease, poverty, and premature death. Fears we may think we have outgrown, but which linger even now in new forms. They sought meaning in ritual and memory, just as we do when we gather for funerals, place flowers on graves, or hold on to photographs of those we love. Their anxieties about class, reputation, and the fragility of life echo down to us, reminding us that history is never as distant as it seems. To walk through a Victorian city in your mind is to wander between brilliance and shadow. You would see gleaming carriages alongside barefoot children, hear the laughter of a wealthy family's dinner party, while outside, a beggar froze on the cobblestones. You would watch a funeral procession halt traffic in one neighborhood, while in another, the dead were carried quietly away to unmarked ground. You would sense the fear of unseen forces, disease, spirits, bad luck, and the stubborn hope that ritual, medicine, or faith could hold them at bay. And perhaps that is the enduring power of the Victorian age. It shows us that progress and suffering, elegance and despair can exist side by side, inseparable. It reminds us that history is not a polished photograph, but a collage of contradictions. For every glittering ballroom, there was a crowded slum. For every innovation, a superstition. For every monument of stone, a forgotten grave. As we step back from this world, we are left not only with the shadows of Victorian life, but with a strange admiration for how people endured it. Their grief was heavy, but they carried it. Their fears were constant, but they found ways to live, love, and leave behind a culture that still fascinates us today. And so, the next time you see a black and white photograph of a Victorian family staring stiffly into the lens, remember what the picture doesn't show. Behind those steady gazes were people shaped by hardship, surrounded by loss, but also sustained by resilience. The dark side of Victorian life may not appear in school books or period dramas, but it lingers in the cemeteries, in the literature, and in the very fabric of how we think about life, death, and everything in between. This was the Victorian world as it truly was, not just the grandeur, but the grief, not just the light, but the shadows. And it is in those shadows that history becomes alive, reminding us that the past was never simple, never easy, but always deeply, hauntingly human.